Hello, welcome to our third video on how to polish your firearm. On the first video, as a quick recap, we talked about the tools and equipment required. We discussed vices, files, lighting, overhead lighting. That's important. What else did we discuss? How to clamp it in a vise. And then on video number two, I showed you how to take really rusty metal that's pitted with bad dings and all that stuff and work all those out with files and the different kinds of files and getting it to the finished file state. So on today's video, our third video, we're gonna look at how to take it from where you end off with a file to take it to your emery paper and get it to a point right before you're gonna blue. And that could be different depending on the bluing that you're gonna do, but we're just gonna say for all purposes here today that you're gonna wanna do like a average hot blue or a rust blue on an old Winchester barrel like we're working with here. And for that, we really don't need to go above 320, 340, and 400. That's pretty much gonna be a very good baseline of polishing. Again, if you have some different polishing requirements, if you're doing like more of a royal blue or something like that, you'll definitely want to step that up, getting into the 600s and above, and maybe even finish with some very bright or very light 3M Scotch-Brite pads and stuff like that. But today we're just gonna keep it simple with emery and taking it to like a 320 grit. So I talked about one of the other videos on case-colored receivers, like if you have a case-colored receiver, how to go about getting that case coloring off. Files won't do it, they'll just slip right off. So in that case, you're really limited to having to use either going under power on a belt sander or something like that, or using emery paper and starting with emery paper. It's the only thing that'll cut it. Now, what you gotta really be aware of on a case colored flat of a receiver or anything that's case colored is you gotta make sure that you cut through all of the hardness so it's all consistent. If it's not, what you'll find is you'll find some shiny patches that will be in the receiver with the rest of it being kind of more of a dull gray. So that means you don't have all that hardness out of it, and you really need to get that all so it's all soft and there's no hard patches in there. But all that being said, let's get on with showing how to get these things finished off up to a final state of emery. So I'm gonna start with 120 and grab some paper here. And so all of our file marks are running longitudinally along with the barrel. So what we're gonna do here is I'm just gonna start with a slight cross polish. And we talked about cross polishing, and cross polishing is just a method of taking polishing lines going one way and cutting them off in the opposite direction. It's gonna work everything down in a much more rapid rate, and it's gonna show you where you got all of your more coarse grits out with your finer grit that you're currently working. So I'm just gonna do a little bit of cross polishing on here. And as I'm doing this, you can certainly see the cross hatch patterns in there and some of the more deeper file marks that are left behind. So what I'm doing here with the 120 is I'm just making sure I'm getting all of those file marks out and it's a consistent 120. I don't want anything left in there that is not 120, which is the goal of each grit, is to get it down to the exact grit that you're working with, nothing left behind. So I'm going to finish this by going straight back and forth, getting everything nice and blended in there. Yeah, a little bit more right here. All right, that flat's looking pretty good. I'm gonna work on to the next flat here. And again, like I talked about in the first video, the only thing I got is just a rag with a little fold in it because it tapers from the breech to the muzzle. I just have a little bit of an extra fold on this end, and that's enough to hold it pretty tight. So again, as soon as I start cross polishing with this, the camera might pick it up, you can see the file marks that are left in there. Now these old barrels, like this Winchester barrel, are very mild. There's probably absolutely no heat treating in these things whatsoever, would be my guess. So you're gonna notice that it's not gonna take a whole lot of time once you start working with this emery paper to get these to come in to shape, especially if you did a good job with the file, getting all of the imperfections out with a file and then finishing it off with a mill smooth. Once you start with a 120, it's gonna pretty rapidly go through each grade. So the hard work is all in the file. By the time you get to the emery, this shouldn't, if everything went well for you and you did it right, shouldn't really take too long. So, and again, I'm just gonna finish my polishing on this, going longitudinally straight back and forth. So this is our 220 grit. And again, I'm gonna start with a cross polish. And then I just work that back and forth. So I'll start off going in this direction, and then I'll start polishing in this direction. And it's not a lot, but it's enough. If you have something really bad you need to work out and you've been working an area, you can always cut across it at a 90 degree if you need to just kind of work some really heavy file marks out and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. The only thing you really need to be aware of was what you really want to do each time is just to make sure that you end each grit. Well, how I like to do it is in the direction of your final polish. Two reasons for it. One, when you start by ending it in the final direction of your polish, meaning longitudinally on the barrel, when you start with your next higher grade and you cut it off at a cross polish, it'll show all your heavy grit below it. But secondly, if you were to accidentally not catch it all out, it's a lot better to have a mark that's deeper from a heavy grit going in the same direction as your polish than if you had one going across it at an angle. You're much less likely to see it. You can still see it on a shiny or blue job, but you're a little bit less likely to see it as long as it's going in the same direction. So I always finish each polishing course with the emery going in the same direction that I want to have and that I'm going to finish the barrel in. I'm very good with that. I'm going to flip the barrel, move on to the next flat. Now I finished my 120 this way, so I'm going to start the 240 going this way. Then cross polishing it again. And you can readily see with the eye, it's very nuanced, but you'll notice it once you start doing this, where those polishing lines start erasing the other ones underneath it in a different direction. So might not make sense while I'm showing it to you as much as once you actually start doing it yourself. So those are both pretty good from the 120 to the 2. Now I'm going to go grab some, what do we got here? 320? Yep. And again, right back to the cross polish. Now I talked about in the last video about the widths of the first video, the widths of the emery paper that I like to use. And there's definitely some reasons behind it. Emery comes in a lot of different widths, but I think the width that you really want is going to be the 2-inch. Again, it allows you to wrap that around the file with enough left over that your fingers have to hold on to it. Also, there's a little bit extra there where you can move it back and forth on that file to get a little bit extra, to use the whole surface of that paper as much as possible. And looking at it from different angles, so the light shines off it differently with that raking light is going to expose any errors that you have as well. So this is coming up absolutely perfect here. It did not take us very long at all, and we went right down to a 320. So I'll show we have a nice consistent finish all the way along. You can see a little bit here at the end where I was working it, where there's probably 100, maybe some 120 or 240 sticking out, but otherwise the rest of it here where I was concentrating is all a nice even finish, and the line is super crisp and sharp, and that's basically it. So now I was talking about what do you look for if you miss a finish or if you miss a grit, or more specifically, you know, like what does it look like if you don't get every grit and grade. So you can see some file marks that are sticking in up here because that was finished with a file, but to make this a little bit more even, I'm gonna put some pretty heavy, we're gonna dig out our old friend the bastard, and I'm gonna put some pretty heavy file marks in there. Now, I am going to completely skip ahead to a 320 and do a little cross polish on it. I want to really expose that, and I think that'll do a pretty good job. The camera should pick that up. So there, I jumped ahead quite a bit from that bastard file to the 320. Now, I'm gonna get in on that a little bit more. So you do not need to use files if you do not want to with emery. I do, because it keeps everything nice and flat, but there are times and sometimes where you might want a little bit of a rubber. So you can use sanding blocks like this, although they're really not super effective in that, you know, you have a whole bunch of it sticking out, and to buy wider emery really wouldn't make it worthwhile. Now, there might be some sanding blocks that are a lot more narrow. What I find to be pretty decent is if you go to a hardware store, a lot of times you can find this orange, reddish orange, I think it's like basically a gasket material, and it has just about the right amount of compressibility, so where if you put emeries on it and you push down, it will conform to the steel just a little bit, not a lot. You don't want a super mushy backing, you want a fairly firm backing. But I just make it, you know, like the same width as a file, and it allows you to wrap your emery on it, so you can always make yourself, and I use this a lot more than this, but another way you can do it is to just use that a rubber block and get on there. Now, like I was gonna say here, you can see in here, and I'm gonna move this around so the camera can pick it up a little bit, there's very, very coarse lines from the bastard from when I went over it with the 320, really made them pop. And that's what it's going to look like if you're polishing and you maybe had like a really bad spot you had to work out with files, and you worked it up and up and up, and if you didn't catch it, by the time you start getting to your finer abrasives, it's gonna start to show those bad spots, and hopefully that's showing that in here. But anyway, that is our octagon. Round barrel is not too much different, although we are gonna use kind of some of the same, a lot of the same techniques, but a little bit different. So this one here, I know we were playing with, this is the one that had that big flat spot in it, and I went and I took it to my big belt sander, and I worked a lot of that out with an 80 grit. So a lot of these circumferential lines in here are 80 grit, but I did make sure to go and put some back in it with a file, the smooth file on the top, and I just wanted to make sure we had a good representation of that. So let's start working this thing out here with the 120 grit. And as I talked about it before, the old shoe shine method is by far the best one to use for this. Now you can see, as I'm going here, it got an awful lot of it out, but you can still see some longitudinal lines in here, and this is a perfect example of 90 degrees to of polishing to your prior polishing. It really exacerbates and shows those lines. So I'm just gonna keep working the 120. And to do a little bit of a crosshatch polish on it, I kind of the same thing with the emery paper. I just work it back and forth, and we're almost done. So if I wanted to, this is a good place for this. If I wanted to work those file marks out of there, this is where having a rubber backer on anything that's other than a flat like an octagon works really nice. I can take on an angle and polish those out pretty easy. And you can get a lot more pressure on your steel with that than you can with like this. But once you're all down to the same grit, that 120 will, if you have 120 all consistently going this way and you go over it another way, it will very, very rapidly remove it. There's not much work that it takes to remove all 120. All right, that's pretty good for the 120. So moving on over to a 240 grit. To do a good job of cross polishing, if you want, going back to, now you could use a file for this, but I generally wouldn't. But the compressibility of the rubber will actually, believe it or not, even though it's slight, will keep you from putting big flat spots in it. So just by working this in this direction, cross polishing with the 220, the 120 out, and again, it takes almost no time to work that out really quickly. Once you had all the surface prep and you didn't skip anything. Now, if you don't feel confident being able to work with the muzzle this way, you can turn it around in the vise, rotate it so the muzzle is pointing away from you, and then, like if this were the muzzle, just work off of it from the long edge to the shorter edge. That'll help you be a little bit more consistent. But as long as you're careful and you keep everything nice and flat, you can certainly work on from the muzzle going that way. So that's looking pretty good. I'm gonna finish again, going radially around the barrel. All right. So, okay, we finished up with the 220. Now I'm gonna hit this with the 3. And as I'm moving my head and rolling it back and forth, I can see radial lines from heavier grits. And if I don't see it in one direction, I move until I get the light so it's catching it right. And if you can move around and not see any lines that's all consistent, then you got it. It's time to move on. And that is pretty much time to move on. Let's check our work here. So that is a pretty good finish on a round barrel and how we work the round barrels down and getting a consistent finish. Now you can see in here there's a couple spots where I didn't get it all out and I would just need to keep working those. But I'm not going to keep doing that here because I don't really feel that you guys want to watch me sit here for hours and work on that. But that is in essence how you work on a round barrel and an octagon, working through each grit to get to your final state of blue, or final state of polish before blue. All right, the only other thing I wanted to do was kind of show you guys how to work from rounds to flats. We worked on a pure round and flat on the octagon, but how do you handle where you have rounds and flats? Now I have a really rotten 76 receiver here and it needs to have the lower tang welded back on, and maybe that's like a whole video in and of itself, how to weld some of this old junk. But anyway, I'm going to show you on here how to basically work on these receivers and how to prep them. So I'm probably going to start with a little bit of a file. Even though we said this was going to be about emery, we're back down to a file. Okay. So that took out the heavy rust. Now I'm going to go back to 120 grit. This brings up a good point. Since we're talking about old Winchesters, you'll see these lines in here, and most of the time they're not ever perfectly, straight back and forth. They're always on kind of an angle. I've heard a lot of people have a lot of different theories over the years as to exactly what they are, but they're in there. Be aware of it if you have an older Winchester or a Marlin, and you'll see them even in old Colts and Savages. They're pretty much steel that comes out from about the same time period. You'll see that an awful lot. Be aware of it, and most of the time, even though you can polish everything down nice and smooth, a lot of times those lines will just stay behind. You cannot really polish them out. Yeah, you can try and you'll be there forever and they'll never really go anywhere. So going back to cross polishing, hoping my body isn't in the shot here too bad. There's a little bit of a depression in this receiver, which is why the files didn't get it completely perfect, and now I'm using my little sanding block here because I want to get down into it. I'm not really worried about making it super, super flat. If I was, I would use a file, but it's so slight, it's not going to matter a whole lot. And it'll still be appropriate when we're done. And a little, as an aside, a little tip, advanced tip on being able to spot guns that have been refinished is the polishing lines. If you know what way exactly those polishing lines are supposed to go, and you see one that you are questioning as to whether it has an original finish or it may have been redone, my experience, I have never seen the factories alter their polishing lines to that level where they would be polishing receivers in one way and then start polishing them in another. There are some variations on that, or, exceptions to that, but as far as like when we're talking Winchester receivers and all that stuff, you're never going to see a factory gun polished with polishing lines running all over the place. They're extremely consistent throughout manufacturing. And I'm just making sure I get all of that 120 here. Now if you're doing an older Winchester receiver, sometimes it's a little tough to be able to differentiate the difference between the lines that run through these things with age and any polishing lines. And the best word of advice I can give you there is, if you're working on it and you don't see those lines dissipating, getting lighter, more faint, then they are definitely the age lines of the steel that run through there, and no amount of polishing is really ever going to get them out. So I got one heavy line that's sticking in up on this corner right here. Might be able to see it. I don't like it. I'm going to make that go away. Okay, I'm going to step up to the 320 now. Once I do this, the whole point of doing this, I'm going to move on to the little round sections. One nice thing about the rubber is when you need to get into these little corners and crevices like that, you can park that thing up in there and work it pretty easily. And you can see, for the most part, exactly what you're doing. If you need to work these areas out really heavy, if there's a lot of pitting in there, a lot of times going with a, doing it on a, well, if you have anything powered with a wheel, a bob, you can even get felt bobs. There's a lot of ways you can do it, but to get like larger felt bobs and put them, you know, like in a drill or something like that with some compound on it. Now, I think I talked about it maybe in like one of the last videos about Dremel tools. I generally would always suggest not to get Dremel tools around these things. It's generally, they're too small in diameter. So, okay, we got that flat worked out. So now how do we get the edges so that they are nice and crisp? So this is where I'm going to start back with a smooth file, and I'm going to work on this edge. Now I'm going to follow this edge, and I'm going to watch that line. I can see where this file is removing material, and I'm just going to make sure that I don't break over that edge and distort that edge, but I can work right up to it, and I can take absolutely any pitting in here, and I'm not pressing hard absolutely at all, but I can take pitting out pretty easy. So this is so small of an area in here, I'm not going to start with 120, it would be too coarse. I'm going to start with the 240, and I'm going to just take my file marks out, working up to that edge, paying attention to where I'm at. Now I'm going to finish it by using my block. There we go. And that one's good. Same thing on the bottom. Okay. And again, I'm not putting hardly any pressure on it, but you can see where all the nicks and the damage are in here easily with the file. And I'm watching this edge. Working up to it, I can even move that edge ever so slightly if I need to. On this here, I don't, so I'm not worried about it, and I'm not going to. I'm just making sure I'm getting out all the pitting right up to the edge. Okay, that's pretty good. Back to the 240, cross polishing that. Now I'm not going to polish out this whole thing in here by hand, because this is where a machine saves massive amounts of time, because doing this by hand with all these concave and contours in here, it takes a long time. It's just a lot of patience and slow going, but you can get the whole thing using the exact techniques that we talked about. It's absolutely no different. So now I have this edge here. Yeah, there's just a little piece in there. The camera might pick that up. I'm gonna roll this around and make sure I'm all good this way. All my lines are going evenly. And the same thing on the top. And that is pretty much it. That is the whole receiver that's polished. Getting the radiuses, how you work the radiuses up to the flats. And these edges are still nice and crisp and clean. And that's pretty much basically it. You would work this whole thing in here, just keep polishing the whole thing, using the exact same techniques. There's really nothing a whole lot different. The only thing, well, since we have a 76 in our hands, this is where something like this comes into play well, is getting in tight crevices like this is always a bugger. It can be pretty tough working out all of this. You can see there's an awful lot of damage back here. That's where I would start with a file. I'm not going to do it here because I don't think there's any need, but you just work up to these edges, and working down to that edge, the polishing lines can't stay going longitudinally. They have to come radially. So that's where you then come back around and work that radius edge down to this flat again, and keeping that all tight in. If there's stuff like that you guys want to know or something like that, let me know in the comments. Specific questions, something that I didn't cover or something that's very specific like that. There's no way to cover everything, and probably in one video it would be forever video. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell with the emery papers. If there's other things that you want to see, other gunsmithing techniques and stuff like that as far as polishing and all that, now we're going to have some other videos coming out where we're going to show rust bluing, how I rust blue, and hopefully maybe dispel some myths there and show you how to do it. And yeah, the easiest way to do it that I have found anyway, and to get as good results as you can get to match or beat factory results. So as always, any comments that you guys have, leave them in below in the video, and we appreciate your likes and subscribing. And until next time, take care, have a great day. Thanks for watching.